Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll start today's presentation. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Credit Repair Ahead of an FSA Loan Application. This webinar is part of our Credit and FSA Program webinar series that includes sessions focused on a variety of Farm Service Agency program topics, including business planning, credit repair, financial and marketing risks, youth loans, microloans, and fractionated land loans, and understanding your rights of appeal. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all the information you'll need to join any of the remaining trainings in this series. You'll also find the slideshows being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. I also invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com, where you will find more information about this series and downloadable copies of the presentations. We will also post and archive videos of each webinar after its conclusion to that webpage. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Attendees can use the control panel to raise their hands, or you can submit questions using the questions dialog box. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. This series is possible with support from the USDA Farm Service Agency and the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who have joined to offer this important series of webinar trainings. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Erin Parker, who is the Assistant Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. As the Assistant Director of the initiative, Erin works on program development, research and writing, and analysis of legislative and regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, businesses, and individual producers. The bulk of her professional work centers on the tension between food and agricultural law and federal Indian law. Most recently, she authored the 2015 Intertribal Food Systems Report, which lifts up nearly 100 innovative food systems programs across Indian country. Before joining the initiative, Erin worked as a staff attorney and research coordinator for the Cabell Commission, a national working group convened by the Secretary of the Interior to repair the federal government's Indian Land Trust Management System. She holds both her JD and her LLM in agricultural and food law from the University of Arkansas, and her final thesis for the LLM program was a practical legal guide to conducting food recovery in the state of Arkansas. She continues to work in the area of food conservation law and policy by volunteering her time and experience to the law school's Food Recovery Project. Thank you, Erin, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you as well for taking time out of your Tuesday afternoon to join us to talk about credit. We are going to discuss credit today, and specifically, as Brian mentioned, we'll be discussing maybe some considerations about your credit history that you might want to make if you're thinking of applying for a loan with the Farm Service Agency. As Brian mentioned, Farm Service Agency is within the United States Department of Agriculture. It's an agency that offers multiple kinds of loans for farmers and ranchers who haven't yet accessed the commercial credit system. FSA loans are generally just intended to help folks to get into that system eventually, but they can be a great opportunity to start out getting a loan for farming and ranching. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the basics that you might want to think about before you start an FSA loan application. There are a few things that you might want to know. What kind of credit, what parts of credit matters. So that's what we're going to start off talking about today. Just those credit basics, like it says on the slide. What is good credit, how to maintain it, why and how it matters when it comes to a loan application with FSA. So I think just generally most folks probably have kind of a basic idea in their heads of what credit is, and there's a really lawyerly definition up here on the screen that says credit is a contractual agreement in which a borrower receives something of value now and agrees to repay the lender at some date in the future, generally with interest. And that's just a fancy lawyerly way of saying that basically it's somebody letting you have a good or service up front and then you pay them back over time. That's really the simplest way to put it. And I put put some examples up here. I think just things generally that we think about when we think of credit being extended to us: car loans, student loans, home loans, credit cards, store credit, and of course farm loans, which is what we're going to be focusing on a little bit today. And in order to do that, I wanted to hit these basic things that are here in these bullet points. I want to talk about credit scores, credit bureaus, credit history, credit reports, credit repair options, and some credit monitoring techniques, tools, and services. Just generally speaking about credit, having good credit will save you money in the long run. It gets you lower interest rates, for one thing, which means less money paid over the life of a loan. It can open up a world of new options if you're thinking of buying a new vehicle, buying a house, getting a credit card, etc. And I know that there's a lot of myths and misinformation, though, that can kind of swirl around out there about what good credit is. Like, what is good credit? How do I maintain that? So what I'm going to do, my best to do today as we go along, is do some credit myth busting to try to get rid of some of those myths, dispel those, and let you know exactly what's going on out there in the world of credit. And when we're talking about FSA loans, your credit history is the thing that's going to be the most important. That's what's the most important when you're trying to get an FSA loan. But we're going to spend the most time talking about that today. I did, before we get into credit history, though, I know everybody always has questions about credit scores and how to read those, what they mean. So in order to explain what a credit history is, I'm going to start by talking about what it isn't. And what it isn't is a credit score. And that's what this slide is all about. When I talk about credit scores in person, usually what I do is ask people to just raise their hands and tell me if they've seen an advertisement recently offering to check their credit score either for free or from some kind of paid service, because there are a lot of companies out there that do this. Just general ads that'll pop up sometimes on TV, or if you're browsing on the internet, you'll see ads from credit.com or creditkarma.com or freecreditreport.com or all these other things that will offer to tell you what your credit score is. They don't really tell you exactly what that is necessarily, or how complicated the world of understanding a credit score can be. So as you can see from this slide, when I ask, what is a credit score? Where does it come from? It depends. There are at least 6 different credit score scales that are kind of floating around out there, and all of them have different ranges. So you'll see one range here. This is representing the FICO score. I think if you've heard of a FICO score, it stands for Fair Isaac Company. That's the name of the company that actually generates that FICO score, which is taking your credit report, which we're going to talk about later, and kind of condensing everything that's in it into a number that's supposed to represent whether or not you're going to be a good borrower. So this score that I put up here is just one of those credit scales, and as you can see, there's not very much wiggle room between those numbers. It's about 49 points of difference. So just improving your credit a little bit can make for a big change in terms of what category you might be in. And that impacts, again, not just your ability to get credit at all or get a loan, but also the kind of interest rates that you get, your repayment plan, and all that kind of thing. Again, don't want to spend too much time on this because, as you'll notice, I've put on this slide, I want you to remember FSA is not going to be using your credit score to make a lending decision. It's your credit history that's more important to FSA. But I did want to just break down a little bit the credit score thing, because there's so many different ones out there, and I'd love to be able to tell you exactly how those companies are calculating that magical number that's called a credit score. But unfortunately, those are proprietary algorithms that they use. What I can tell you is that, generally speaking, a credit score is based on a bunch of different factors weighted differently depending on what company is producing the score. So I've listed some of them here. You just think about the age of accounts, you think about your total repayment time, whether you've been paying on time or not, like all of those things are going to impact your score. So even though FSA doesn't use it, there are going to be other lenders out there in the world for other types of credit who do those. So I did want to briefly just go ahead and outline how you go about getting your credit score before we move on to your credit history. How do we get a score? I mentioned before that there are some free options out there that are available when you see those ads for Credit Karma or Credit.com. And what those will do is give you kind of a ballpark idea of where a credit score for you may actually be. But that free price tag means that it's not going to be an actual score. So if you want, for example, your FICO score, you can't get it from Credit Karma or Credit.com. It's a great way to get a ballpark, but it's not going to be the actual number. So if a lender was looking at something for you, and again, this won't be FSA because they're not looking at your credit score, but if you were going to go buy a car and they were concerned with your credit score, what Credit Karma tells you, what Credit.com tells you is not necessarily going to be the actual number. I've seen it. I use those myself, and I also have a credit card that gives me my actual FICO score. So I can tell you sometimes there's up to like 10 or 20 points difference between Credit Karma and what's actually my FICO score. So just know if you're using those things, it's a great way to ballpark it. It's not going to be the exact thing. You can get the exact thing. For example, if you want your FICO score, you can actually sign up for an account with them, but they'll charge you for it. And that's about $30 a month, so that knowledge cost can add up pretty quickly. I've left you the website here just in case that is something that you're interested in doing. But again, FSA is not going to actually be using your credit score. So if you're super concerned for right now with just getting an FSA loan, that number is not the whole picture. But before, and I will talk about this a little bit later, but there are Native Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFI. If you're concerned about your credit score, they can be a great resource and lend a hand in this space. So I wanted to mention them, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that later in the PowerPoint, but I did want to mention those are opportunities to get your credit score, even though FSA isn't going to look at it. So that's your credit score. What's more important for an FSA loan, though, as I've said, is your credit history. And if we're going to talk about your credit history, that means we need to talk about credit reports. And that means we need to talk about credit bureaus. So I know it sounds like it's getting very complicated very quickly, but it's really not that bad. We're going to break it down. So for personal credit, so any credit accounts you may have open or that you may have recently closed might be reported to a credit bureau. And I've listed the 3 major credit bureaus here on the screen. These are the 3 major players. These are really the ones that you need to worry about when you're monitoring your credit or repairing your credit. It's Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Those are the 3 credit bureaus, and you can kind of think of them as sort of a library for credit reports. Any kind of credit that you've gotten that actually decide, if that lender wants to report to a credit bureau, then they will house that information and it creates your credit history. So when you go get your credit report, it's every detail that's been reported to those bureaus. Just a side note, while each of those companies will produce a credit report for you that has information about credit accounts that have been reported to them, not every lender reports to the credit bureaus. Just want to stick a pin in that for now because that piece of information will become important later as we go on. But for now, you can just kind of think of your credit report as a report card for your financial history, and it's generated by these 3 major credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. If you want to access your credit report, which is a great thing to do, and especially if you're thinking about getting a loan from FSA and looking at that credit history and kind of seeing what's out there for it, you have a right by federal law to get your credit report every year, once a year, for free. And you can get 1 credit report from each of the 3 bureaus every year. So it's 1 credit report, but it feels like 3 because you want to get it from all 3, and we'll go into why in just a second. But to get started with this process, what you can do is log on to www.annualcreditreport.com, and I put the link right up here in the slide. This is a free thing. It is a right you have by federal law. It's free, and you can go and get a copy of your credit report from all 3 major credit bureaus once a year through this website. Just a side note, I know sometimes people will say, oh, well, if you pull your credit report, it's going to lower your credit score and you're not going to look as creditworthy. It depends. We'll talk about inquiries, which is what that is, in a few slides. But for right now, I just want to pull out and say Getting this free report through annualcreditreport.com, that does not count as something that's going to lower your credit score or affect your credit worthiness. This is just a right that you have to actually see your credit report, to see what people are reporting about you, and make sure all that information is accurate, and most importantly, give you an opportunity to correct any information that may not be accurate. But pulling this report from all three bureaus once a year from annualcreditreport.com will not lower your credit score. One of the things, so I just wanted to highlight that. And also, there are a couple of different ways you can access this report. I've also listed on this slide. If you are happy using the internet, you can just use that site and that'll be fine. If you're not that happy using the internet and you want to use mail and phone for this, I've listed the toll-free number for Annual Credit Report here on the screen. It's 877-322-8228, and you can get started getting your free credit reports that way through that process. It will be a little bit slower because whether you go through the internet or whether you go through the mail, the annual credit report folks are going to want to make sure they verify your identity before they just release your credit report to you. That's very important. So if you're going to go through the mail, it'll just slow that down a little bit because there's going to be some back and forth as you verify your identity and then mail that in, and then they'll mail you your credit reports. But it is still possible to go through that process without going through the website if you're not comfortable doing that. So you do have that option available, and that's still free, and it still won't lower your credit score to check your credit this way. You can only do it once a year, but it is still a right that you have to get it for free. It will not give you a credit score, however. So again, if you're concerned about your credit score, there are other ways to do that, but this is just to see your credit reports. So since you're on a webinar, we can go back, Brian, I think. Oh no, that didn't show up. Okay, so since you're on a webinar, I'm going to guess that you can probably use the internet reliably to do this. And so what you do is log on to annualcreditreport.com. It's going to ask you for your social security number, and it's going to ask you for some other information to make sure that it's really you asking for your report and that it's not an identity thief. I know it feels a little bit weird to put in your private information sometimes, either on the internet or to mail it in, but that is something that they're doing. It is actually a safeguard. That's, I think, one of the reasons they offer the opportunity to do this through the mail. I think some people feel a lot more comfortable maybe putting that through the mail. Some people don't feel comfortable putting it in the mail at all, and they would much rather do it on the internet where they can see that a site is secure. If you're looking ever on a web browser and you see that little lock up there with an HTTPS /, that means you're on a secure site, and there's some security protocols for that website that's protecting your information. So those are two different options, but they're going to ask you kind of for the same information to make sure that it's really you asking for this kind of stuff. So once you've done that, then you're going to make sure that you ask for your report for all three credit bureaus. You need Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, all three. And what was supposed to be on that last slide was actually a picture of a sample report from Experian, but for some reason it's not showing up on the slide. Basically, though, what it's going to spit out at you, well, I'll get to that in a second. Before we get to that, just know that you want to make sure you get all three. And the reason that you want to get all three is that sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes it will only show up on one report. Sometimes a lender will only report to one of those three credit bureaus. So you might see an account on one and it won't appear on the other two. And if there's something wrong with it, the only way that you'll know is if you've gotten all three reports to look at. Again, when you do it through this annual process, it's free. So you can get all three for free, from one from each credit bureau. And just a side note before we go on to kind of reading through your credit report and deciding what's on there and what you might need to report. So sometimes you will see ads or something for people who are saying that if you pay them kind of an exorbitant fee, they will do all this process for you, and they will clean up your credit, or they'll monitor your credit or file disputes or something for you. Generally speaking, those things are scams. Don't do them. Everything that we're going over on this webinar today is something that you can do for yourself for free without generally speaking, for free without paying any money, and you can kind of take charge of your credit life and your credit history. Whether you're trying to apply for an FSA loan or you're trying to apply for a car loan or anything else, this is absolutely something that you can do, and you don't need to pay anybody to do it. There are sometimes credit clinics that will be offered by like a nonprofit or a public institution or a native CDFI, and those are legitimately helpful, and they're usually free of charge. They're usually going to be a situation where you can sit down with somebody one-on-one, and you show up with your credit report and a willingness to work, and they will give you some great advice about how to go through your credit report and read it and make sure that everything's accurate, and if it's not, how to report that. But just generally, I just wanted to highlight that because I was driving around the other day and there was actually a sign by a stoplight for just like an 800 number that said, oh, just call our number and pay us and we'll repair your credit for you. And there wasn't even like a company name on it or anything. And that's the kind of thing I think sometimes, because credit can kind of touch on some things that are really anxiety inducing and personal for us, that sometimes we're willing to pay people to do that for us, but you really don't have to. And a lot of times people are scamming. So just be aware that that's out there. And I wanted to highlight that before we started going through how to read your credit report, because I know that this sounds like a lot of information, but it's important, and not just to the FSA loan process. It's just in terms of your financial health. This will save you a lot of money and give you more time to do the things that you love, like growing food, raising animals, spending time with your family. So that's what this is designed to do. So what that last slide was supposed to be was an example of an Experian credit report, and that it would be what they would actually send you after you went through that annual credit report process. There were number blocks on there to highlight some important sections, so I'll just tell you what they are since you can't see them, unfortunately. One of them was a report number. When you go through this annual credit report process, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion will each give you a report. Every company will also give you a report number, and that's a crucial piece of information to have. Just make sure you hang on to that, make a note of it, because if you need to file a dispute, which we'll go over in a few slides, you'll need to have that report number and reference it when you're talking to both the lenders and to the credit bureaus. The report that comes from all three of those bureaus, they may be in a little bit of a different order, but they're going to have the same pieces of information, or the same categories of information rather, on there. You're going to see any potentially negative items. It will highlight those for you. It will tell you about any good open accounts that you have currently. It'll go over credit inquiries, which we'll discuss in detail in just a second, and it will also go through your personal information. So that was, and I wanted to highlight personal information because I have definitely had the situation before where my mom ended up on my credit report. We have the same initials, and so I think she had once co-signed on a loan for me when I was really young, and somehow she ended up back on my credit report for something totally different. And so that's the kind of thing, like, you just want to make sure as you're reading through, you read everything, because every once in a while people make mistakes. So this slide right here is just about reading through that credit report and making sure that you recognize every single thing listed. Your report may be really short. If you're young or you've never used any credit, that's totally fine. Your credit reports may be really long, and that's fine too. But just whatever you have, this is kind of the process. Just go through and start making notes. Some things to look out for: you want to make sure, as I've said here, you recognize every account that's listed. And I called out here that student loan debt can sometimes be hard to recognize, because sometimes I do have short panic moments when I look at my credit reports, because student loans get sold so frequently that sometimes it can be hard to remember that, oh yeah, 6 months ago, I did get a letter from a new bank saying that now they own my student loan debt, and I just didn't remember, because there's just so many of them. So before you totally panic if you see a large amount from a creditor like that and you know you have student loans, it might be that. You can always Google those things, and it's usually pretty easy to figure out who is who. If you don't recognize an account, make a note of it, because that's definitely something you're going to want to dispute or get a credit validation for. And again, we'll go over that in just a second. But for now, as we're reading through, we're just making notes. If you do recognize every account that's listed, that's awesome. Just double check to make sure that all of them are reported accurately on all three reports from all three credit bureaus. Because sometimes one of the bureaus will report something that isn't accurate, but the other two bureaus will get it right. And if you only got one report and it happened to have been the one where it was right, you wouldn't know that the other one was out there reporting negative info that was adversely affecting your credit worthiness. So that's why I say just make sure that you get all three, because they do have different information sometimes. And if you need to correct something, you've got to have that to know. Once you've looked at everything on here, this paragraph at the bottom is a good reminder to make sure that you ask yourself if there's anything that you don't see. So if you have an account with somebody in good standing somewhere that isn't listed on any of your credit reports, just make a note of that. Not every creditor, again, is going to automatically report to any of these credit bureaus. And indeed, some companies, like John Deere Financial, for example, they have a practice where they just, as a company, don't report your accounts with them to any of the credit bureaus. They have, different reasons for doing that, but what they will do, and if you ask often, is to write a letter of reference that you can then put in your credit file to say, yes, this person has an account, it's in good standing, it's been open for this many years, et cetera, et cetera. What that won't do is improve your credit score, and it won't improve your credit history necessarily, but it's good for a future lender like FSA, for example, who's concerned with your credit history, to be able to see that. And that's especially true if you don't have a lot of credit that reports. It lets a potential lender see that you've been great about this financial responsibility. It just happens to be for an account that doesn't report to the credit bureau, which is really outside of your control. So next slide. My pictures aren't showing up. So this is another sample report, or it's supposed to be from Equifax this time. And on here, it would have shown the exact same kinds of categories of information that you saw on the Experian report. It just would have looked like they would have been in a different order. So just wanted to show you another example of what a credit report could look like from a different credit bureau. So we'll go on to the next slide. So we're still reading through credit report. A credit report will have a section for inquiries. Now this is where I talked before about checking your credit and how you may have heard that that can lower your credit score and lower your credit worthiness. That's kind of misstated. This is where that myth kind of comes from. So you and potential lenders or creditors can ask for a copy of your credit report. People can really only ask, other people can only ask if you've given them permission, but you can make credit reports on your own. All of those things are called inquiries, and inquiries come in two flavors. There's a hard inquiry and a soft inquiry. A hard inquiry does actually affect your credit score, but soft inquiries don't. So when you're getting that free annual report from annualcreditreport.com, you are getting your report, and that's a soft inquiry. It doesn't affect your credit, and it actually doesn't, it shouldn't show up to anybody else. Soft inquiries are generally visible mostly to you. They don't affect your credit score, they don't affect your credit worthiness. Hard inquiries do. There's a limited amount of time by statute that they can actually appear on your credit report. I think it's 2 years now. That's the longest they can stay on. What it happens is, like, you go in and apply for a loan, like you wanted to go buy a new truck, and you apply for financing through the dealership. They check your credit. Those inquiries will pop up then because you've applied for credit. So it's not always bad. Usually what happens is that you go to the dealer, you apply for credit, it might lower it a couple of points here and there. And generally what happens is that if you get credit from that person who's checked your credit, then it will bounce back up. Sometimes it takes about 30 days, but it's not like a nosedive for your credit at all. I just wanted to kind of highlight that and let you know what was going on there. This is another situation where you always want to read through your inquiries, though, especially your hard inquiries, to make sure that you recognize all of the entities that are listed as making an inquiry, because mistakes and identity theft do happen. And just as an aside, the reason that I kind of dove into understanding the world of credit myself, I know this can be a really anxiety-inducing situation because I actually had my identity stolen by a relative twice. So please don't be embarrassed ever about reaching out to me. My contact information will be on the last slide of this PowerPoint. You can always email me or call me if you have any kind of questions about this stuff. I know how scary it can be when something like that happens, but it's definitely possible to bounce back from. So please don't be shy about asking questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question at the end, in front of, in air quotes, everybody, then please feel free to reach out to me at any point because I am always happy to answer questions about anything like that. So that's inquiries. Hard and soft. Soft don't matter. Hard inquiries do make a difference in your credit history, but they aren't necessarily bad. So that's how that works. So once you've actually gone through everything, I've talked a lot about disputing the information that's on your credit report, but how do we actually do that? You need to take a look at that list as you were going through all three of your credit reports and you were writing down, hey, this looks familiar, this doesn't look familiar, all that kind of stuff. All the stuff that doesn't look familiar. After you've looked at that list again and you've determined that you definitely don't have any memory or knowledge of any of those accounts, then it's time to start filing some disputes and either getting those things off of your credit report or at least figuring out if for some reason they are actually tied to you somehow. So the first thing to do is to actually dispute directly with the credit bureaus. In the pictures that unfortunately did not show up on this PowerPoint, there's a section in your credit report that you get from Equifax, from TransUnion, and from Experian. Each of those companies has their own dispute process. It's going to be the same paperwork. It'll just be in a different part of your credit report for each company. You can do that online. If you choose to do the annualcreditreport.com online, you can also file disputes online. Or if you prefer, you can do the exact same thing that you did when you requested your annual credit report through mail. You can call toll-free. The Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, all three will give that number on your credit report. You can call them and request that they mail you a dispute form, or you can write them a letter and send it certified mail, return receipt requested. And just generally, anytime you're doing anything with your credit, whether you're disputing something or you're applying for something or you're asking for a letter of reference, if you write it down and you send it through the mail, just make sure that you always send it certified mail, return receipt requested. That proves, and keep a copy of it, that proves that you've sent it and it proves that they've received it. And you'll actually get confirmation from the Postal Service through the mail if you've asked for that return receipt. So that's always really important. Side note just about identity theft. If you've been going through your credit report and you don't think things are yours, it's not just that they're wrong, it's that they are not your accounts. That should be reported pretty immediately through the Federal Trade Commission. They have a website, identitytheft.gov, that I've listed here. Report that immediately. You can also put a fraud alert on your credit report with each bureau. I don't want to spend too much time on that because it's kind of its own separate process and we could be here all afternoon, but I did just want to call out really fast that if that's something you think has happened to you, act as quickly as you can. Again, I'm always available to try and help answer questions about things like that. But just if you don't recognize all these things on your credit report, that may be a sign that something, someone has borrowed your identity, and you definitely don't want that to happen. But if it's just that things are wrong, so for example, I had my very first car I bought, they only reported to, or they reported to all three credit bureaus, but they had an issue with TransUnion where a bunch of accounts got reported negatively that were actually all good and paid in full. So since they were a local lender, it was easier for me to just pick up the phone and call them first before I went through all the rest of this process. Like if it's somebody that I kind of say play it by ear. I usually follow up or recommend following up with a letter that's sent certified mail, return receipt requested, but sometimes things can be faster. If you know that you paid that account in full and you know the lender, and they're local, sometimes it's easier to just pick up the phone and say, hey, this is on my credit credit report? What's going on? Like in my situation, I was the third call that they'd had that morning because people had been starting to realize that, oh, hey, there was a problem. And that was how they figured out that they had misreported a bunch of stuff, which is definitely something a lender's going to want to know. So if you think it might be faster because you know folks and there's a mistake, then that's always an option. Again, I do think it's a good idea just to follow up with a letter that's sent certified mail, kind of recapping the conversation that you had with them on the phone, just to give you some tangible proof that you actually contacted the creditor. It wasn't a problem for me, and I never had to follow up on it again. They fixed it immediately, but just in case. I'm a lawyer. I'm risk averse, so I always say better safe than sorry for stuff like this. But that's kind of a more expeditious way, I think, of fixing problems that actually happen on your credit report. If it's identity theft, there's going to be more paperwork involved than this, just FYI. If you call companies, though, that are listed on your credit report that you don't think are yours, they're going to send you paperwork back. And just in general, when you're fixing things that are on your credit report, whether it's identity theft or whether it's just inaccurate information, sometimes the process may not be swift. You do have to be very proactive about it, especially with identity theft. It may take a while, and I think it took me a few months to a year to get everything cleaned up from mine and get all those accounts that I didn't sign up for off of my credit report. But it is possible. It's possible to do it if you're just proactive about it and you stay on it, using all of these free resources, plus a little bit of cash for certified mail, return receipt requested. You can do all of this yourself without ever having to pay another entity to do it for you. Next slide. Thank you. So this is another situation that might come up, and I wanted to call this out particularly because it does bear on FSA loan applications. Occasionally there are negative things on our credit reports that we know are unfortunately accurate, and that happens because of deaths in the family, maybe personal or family illness, job loss, identity theft. All these factors that are outside of our control can result in slow or late payments that will eventually affect our credit histories and show up on our credit reports. But when that happens, I just want everybody to know, you're not without an option, and FSA can take those things into account. Even though they're concerned with your credit history and they want an acceptable credit history, there's still a provision that will let people take into account those things that are outside of your control that were just sort of temporary. For other lenders, you can definitely do another thing that's filing a note. You file a note about this on your credit report, and you can do that directly with each credit bureau. If you do it online through annualcreditreport.com, you can do it that way. You can also call and ask for notes to be added. Those are also options. You can mail the notes in and ask the credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion to record that on your credit report for any negative activity that may be there. It's not an excuse, and it's not promising to pay a bunch of money or anything to anybody. All it is just an explanation to any future lenders, like for example FSA, who might be concerned with your credit history when you're trying to get a loan, so they can kind of take that into account, because it does happen. Those are situations that pop up for people, and knowing that those situations were temporary and that they were outside of your control can be pretty key. So just to summarize our credit basics, your credit score is a number, and it reflects your credit worthiness. That means it affects how lenders decide to lend or not credit to you. FSA doesn't use this number in lending decisions, though. Your credit history is what FSA is looking at. They want an acceptable credit history from their borrowers, and that is something that's going to come from your credit reports. There are 3 major companies, 3 credit bureaus that issue credit reports: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Those are the companies that keep credit reports. And you can get those reports for free every year by visiting annualcreditreport.com or calling their toll-free number. And that number, again, was in the slides previously. So if you're interested in doing that, you can download these slides over here and make sure that you have that number accessible. And finally, these different lenders do report, or different lenders do report differently, so your credit reports may look different from each credit bureau. So you just want to read carefully, make sure that everything is accurate on all three of those reports. And if there are um, things that are wrong, you can dispute them and get them fixed. And if there are negative entries that are accurate due to factors outside your control, you can always make notes that explain kind of what was going on and how it was remedied after that temporary situation ended. And I think, yeah, here we go. So before we move on to a little bit more about FSA, I wanted to make a note about native CDFIs. I mentioned them once before. A native CDFI is a community development financial institution. They can be amazing resources here in terms of repairing credit, doing ongoing credit monitoring. They've got a couple of different things that have happened in recent years that have just been really wonderful opportunities for people who want to do this. So they've begun partnering, many of them, with the Credit Builders Alliance, and that helps them address both access to credit and credit building, credit monitoring in Indian country. And they can do two really helpful things here. First, they can help you report good items on your credit report to two of the three bureaus. By partnering with that Credit Bureaus Alliance, they can actually appear on your credit report. If the CDFI makes you a small loan, then they can report now to two of those three bureaus, and that will help you build a solid credit history, which is really important. Just because even for a small loan, just 6 months of on-time payments will help create a really solid history and can really, really improve credit scores, which, although FSA isn't concerned with your credit score, credit history is still important. So even small loans can earn you anywhere between 15 and 100 points on your score if they're paid on time for at least 6 months. So the native CDFIs are an amazing opportunity in that space. They can also help monitor credit going forward. So if you've just checked your credit history for the first time and you're interested in maintaining good credit and keeping an eye on that credit, which I hope that you are, you can work with a native CDFI. With your permission, they can do that thing where they make a soft inquiry, which again doesn't lower your credit score. But all that does is just help you monitor more than just once a year. So you get your free report from annualcreditreport.com once a year. That's your one chance by law to be able to do that. But you can actually work with a CDFI to continue doing ongoing monitoring with your permission. And again, that won't lower your credit score. It'll just allow you to keep up with your credit report more than just once a year. So now we're going to turn more fully to FSA here in the last part of our webinar. I've said a few times that credit scores aren't the important thing to FSA lending determinations. So now I want to talk about what is actually important in terms of credit with FSA before they make a loan. So specifically, what FSA is looking for is, as I've said a couple of times during this presentation, an acceptable credit history from an applicant. Well, what does that mean? One of the things that they take into account includes your credit history with the federal government. So if you've had previous loans with the federal government, those repayments will matter to a determination of what is an acceptable credit history from an applicant. Importantly, I wanted to highlight that FSA doesn't automatically disqualify you from getting a loan if you've had a previous history of slow payments or you have no credit history. Again, FSA is really designed to help people, especially people in credit deserts who have difficulty accessing the commercial credit system, be able to access credit for their farming and ranching operations. So because of that, if you don't have credit history, that's not necessarily an automatic barrier to getting an FSA loan. And neither is that previous history of slow payments that we talked about a little bit ago when we were talking about leaving notes on credit reports to explaining those things. And the reason that I went in such detail about that was because FSA will actually look at recent poor credit if problems were due to those temporary conditions that were outside your control. So things like illness, job loss, that kind of thing. Those are things that they will take into account. It's not an automatic disqualification from getting a loan, which is good. So if you're worried about your credit history, because that's what FSA looks like, just remember your credit score is not something they look at. That's not part of your credit history. for FSA's purposes, and you don't have to have a perfect credit history. And if you don't have a credit history, that's okay too. There are other ways to build a credit history alongside this if you're interested. As I said, that native CDFI program with small loans is a really, really great way to build a credit history. And working with native CDFIs can be an awesome opportunity in that regard. But if you don't have credit history, it's not necessarily a bar to getting an FSA loan. So these are, I wanted you to have these in the slides. I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but I did want you to have them if you wanted to download the slides, and you can look at them in more detail later. This is just a list of general requirements to getting a loan through FSA. I bolded the ones here that impact credit, since that's what we've been talking about today, but here, you know, as you can see, there are several more. We've talked about the acceptable credit history here. We've talked about previous federal loans and repayments mattering, so previous debt forgiveness by an agency or by the agency, Farm Service Agency. Also not being delinquent on federal debt, except tax debt. IRS, as usual, IRS is in a world of its own, so we don't worry about that necessarily, but if you've got like student loan debt or that kind of thing, you can't be delinquent on repayments when you're closing your loan with FSA. That's an important thing to note here. Also, again, because FSA is designed to help people kind of get used to credit before accessing the commercial credit market, these loan programs rather, you do have to be unable to obtain sufficient credit elsewhere, so that's on here as well. But there are some other requirements that you can kind of read through. No possession of controlled substances, for example. You have to be legally able to accept responsibility for a loan, and all these other circumstances as well have to be met in order to be able to access FSA loan programs. But again, just the ones that I bolded are the ones that we've kind of been talking through today that credit has an impact on. So just to recap a little bit, FSA doesn't concern itself with credit scores for potential borrowers. We're looking at credit history only, which means taking charge of your credit history by looking at your credit report can be really, really important. So just kind of knowing what's out there and understanding maybe your eligibility or what you might need to work on in order to become eligible for lending programs. But if you do have some bumps on your credit report, or you just don't really have any credit history to speak of, especially if you're a beginning farmer or rancher or you're inside a credit desert, those are not disqualifications from getting an FSA loan necessarily. That can still happen. The loans, this is kind of a case-by-case basis. Like I didn't really give any specific examples of people because it really is just kind of a one-on-one determination. But just in general, remember that leaving notes on your credit file, making sure you're reading your report in detail can be really helpful to understanding what your credit history is, and that's what matters for FSA. So in part one, where we talked about just kind of what happens before you get an FSA loan, this is that FSA loans are a great place to start if you're looking for financing for your operation. And we're not going to go into detail about this today because this isn't, the subject of this is credit before an FSA loan application, but after you get an FSA loan, eventually what will happen is that you will graduate into the commercial credit system. Once folks are financially prepared to transition into that commercial credit system, what happens is that FSA loans get refinanced with a commercial lender. So you'll be in that commercial credit system at that point. So knowing the ins and outs of credit kind of at the beginning can really help once you get into that commercial credit system, into that space, to already understand everything that we've been talking about today, and being able to monitor your credit report, knowing that you can log on to annualcreditreport.com once a year and get reports from Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian to make sure that everything on there is correct, knowing how to correct your information if it's incorrect, knowing how to report identity theft. These are all really crucial skills when it comes to not just before the FSA loan process, but during and after, once you're in the commercial credit system, being able to monitor those things. Because again, the better your credit, the more money you're going to save. So that's the end of my presentation, actually. I tend to talk too fast. But if you've got questions, I think we can take them now, and Brian can walk you through kind of that process. This is my contact information here on the screen. It's my email and my phone number. Please, if you've got any questions, again, I know sometimes credit issues can be really sensitive. I am completely sensitive to that myself, and I'm totally open to getting phone calls or emails from folks. Just if you've got questions that you don't want to ask in front of other people, that it's fine to email or give me a phone call. So thank you very much for listening, and I am open for questions.
All right, thank you, Erin. Just a reminder to everyone on the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use your control panel to either raise your hand or you can type a question into the questions box, and I will read it out loud for Erin. Also, just wanted to make a note that it looks like we lost some of our graphics in the presentation. So I'll be sure to go through and get those graphics imported back in. And when I post this presentation to our website, those graphics will be in there. We'll make sure that that gets fixed. Erin, actually, I had just one question that occurred to me during your presentation. Maybe you could explain to folks what is a credit desert, because you mentioned that a couple times.
Oh, sure. So a credit desert, much like a food desert, if you've heard that term, just means that within a certain geographic distance away from your home or where your operation is, there is no lending service available. So no farm credit office, no ag credit office, no FSA office, no commercial bank or institution where you could actually drive in and go and fill out an application and get credit that way. That's what that means. So I think a lot of the struggle in Indian country sometimes is that there are just giant swaths of land that don't have folks present to make loans to people who want to farm and ranch. So these programs can kind of be an intermediary there for you. And that's one way you can kind of work and get started or expand or continue operations.
All right, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So with that, we will conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and just a reminder that this presentation and all the other presentations in this series can be found at the web address on your screen right now, indigenousfoodandag.com/FSA, and a video of this presentation as well as the slides will be available within the next few days. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.